goes through pain, whatever's first.
Good evening, welcome back to Why We Can't Wait, Season 2, Episode 2 of the Grace Tapes. I just want to welcome you back out. Thank you for continuing to be a blessing to me, and I pray that as we do this, as we continue in our series in the camp of Why We Can't Wait, that I am a blessing to you, and I just thank you for continuing to come out and continue to support all those that sent emails and Facebook messages and what have you, and asking when will I be back. We are back, and like I said, with episode 2, and last week I told you I would be speaking on grace, and I wanted to first make sure that we remember what grace is, as the definition as we gave last week. And grace was defined as the free and unmerited favor of God as manifested in the salvation of sinners and the bestowal of blessings, a divinely given talent or blessing, the condition or fact of being favored by someone. I told you that the goal of this series was to open up your mind and change with this idea of grace. And I think I want to start off with something that a phrase that people have heard over and over again as we get ready to go to the scripture. Is going to be 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 7 through 10. But it's that in that 10th verse that we find, it's in that 9th verse that we find something that we as Christians have heard so much. And it says, my grace is sufficient for you. We want to just talk about this grace being sufficient. But let's go ahead and go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 7 through 10. Once again, as always, I'll be reading coming out of the NIV. So go ahead and pause the tape. And as you pause, get your place. And as you pause and get your place, don't forget to get and subscribe to these videos. Tell someone about it. Let's get started. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 7 through 10. And the word of the Lord reads, to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Verse 9 again. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you. Growing up around the church, I've heard this scripture so many times. I know that some of the people even the viewers out there, you guys have heard it. My grace is sufficient, my grace is sufficient, my grace is sufficient. And I'm not sure if we really understand what that means. So of course, we all know that I'm a fan of the dictionary. I like to define words and break them down and just make it plain. So of course, as always, from the Oxford College Dictionary, we define the word sufficient. Sufficient is to be enough, adequate. The base word of sufficient is to suffice, enough or adequate to meet the needs of. Sufficiency, another form of suffice, the condition or quality of being adequate or sufficient. Well, we must then take those two words. What is it to be enough? Enough, also defined in the Oxford College Dictionary, as much or as many as required to the required degree or extent. Adequate is defined as satisfactory or acceptable in quality or quantity. So we take enough and adequate, as much or as many as required to the required degree or extent. Adequate being satisfactory or acceptable in the quality or quantity. So we take the definition and we're seeing that it says my grace is sufficient. My grace is more than enough for you. My grace is more than enough for you. But he said unto me, my grace is more than enough for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. We take grace and we see this, my grace is sufficient, and we always look at sufficient as it just being enough. But we have to realize how magnificent, how big this is. He says, my grace is enough for you. My grace is sufficient for you. If sufficient means enough, and sufficient means adequate, and enough and adequate can be defined as many or as much as required to the required degree or extent, and grace falls upon everyone that accepts Christ in their life. It falls upon all believers, and sometimes, and as well as unbelievers alike. If it falls amongst everyone, and it's as much or as many as required for this person, as much as many required for that person, we must then venture to say that God's grace is more than enough. Because His grace doesn't run out. His grace is not lost anywhere. We're talking about God's grace. We're talking about this thing that is good. His all sufficient, His more than enough grace, His adequate grace. But we often make grace to be this small, tiny thing that is just enough. And we look at grace and we say, well, grace, I'm thankful for grace. And we look at this definition of it. He says, my grace is sufficient. And we say it's just enough to meet the needs. But it's more than enough, because it not only meets your needs, it meets the person next to your needs. So we must imagine, we must believe, we must think that God's grace is big in its quantity. It's big in its delivery. It's big. God's grace is more than enough. God's grace is enough to meet your needs. We must not stop there, because what happens is we read the scripture and we see my grace is sufficient for you. And we stop there. But there's more. There's more. He says, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And then Paul goes on to say, it's because I delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. We must think about that, where he says that it seems as if Paul is in a quandary of the English oxymoron. How can you be weak and be strong? How can you be weak and be strong? He's saying at the same time that he's weak, that he is strong. Because of God's grace, at the same time he is weak, then he is strong. We often use these titles that I am only human, I am a work in progress, and we look at these things and we look at them as downfalls. But God is saying, but when you're weak, then am my strength made perfect. When you're weak, then will my grace take over. When you are weak, when you feel like you can't go anymore, then you will find that my grace is sufficient for you. We lose sight of this. We lose sight of this because we say this, I'm only human. We must be thankful that we're only human. Because we're only human, we are met with God's amazing and great grace. Because we are a work in progress, we are met with God's amazing and great grace. And because we find ourselves only human, we find ourselves falling, we often find ourselves missing and we find ourselves keeping ourselves from going on and trying out our hands at the ministry and trying out or putting our hands to the plow, if you will. Because we say that I'm still working and God is still working on me. I'm still a work in progress and God's not through with me yet. And we say all these things, and all these things are excuses to keep us from moving on. But God said, my grace is sufficient for you. Because when you are weak, then am I strong. Paul said, when I am weak, then I am strong. When I find myself not able to go anymore, when I find myself being tormented by the devil, when I find myself being berated by insults, when I find myself in hardship, when I find myself in persecution, when I find myself in weaknesses, then am I strong, because I am met by God's great grace. We often put a box around God's grace, but God's grace says, my God, my grace is enough, more than enough for you and you and you. All you could think of, God's grace is able to fit it, to cover it, and to push it, to keep it going. We need to hold on to this thing called grace. Meet this thing called grace at the door of our weaknesses, at the door of our downfall, at the door of our struggles, and realize that God's grace is there to keep you going. We already know that we are merely human. We already know that we are flesh and that this flesh is weak. But there's a scripture in Romans that said that the law was added that the sin may increase, but when sin increase, grace increase all the more. So that means that no matter how fleshly you are, no matter how weak you are, you have some grace that is more and more and more than your weakness, more than your flesh, more than all those things. God's grace grace is more than enough. We need to stop putting this thing called grace in a box and closing it up and put it to the side, because grace is there to meet us wherever we are. The grace of God is a gift, yet we treat it like it's a minimum wage job. We act as if being met by God's grace diminishes our strength, but rather it complements our weaknesses. He says, then when Paul tells us that when I am weak, then am I strong. He glorifies in these insults and these persecutions and in the weaknesses, because at that point he has the opportunity to say that I've been met by God's grace, and he said that I am looking and searching for a time. Each time I'm giving glory, I'm searching for these weaknesses, I'm searching for these persecutions, because I know I'm stronger with God's grace with me. It is God's grace that's there to push you, to keep you going, to meet you where you are falling short, where this flesh it seems like it is no match. You feel like that you can't beat this flesh. Then where you find that God's grace is more than enough. Romans told us, where sin increased, grace increased all the more. All the more. It lets us know that if sin keeps going, grace is going to keep going even further. If this flesh keeps going, grace is going to go even further. If your weakness keep going, your grace is going to go even further. And we find in Romans that grace is stronger than sin. So if grace is more than sin and stronger than sin, there's no amount of sinning, there's no amount of persecutions, there's no amount of flesh, there's no amount of insults, no amount of hardships that can outweigh God's great grace. The grace was sent here to meet us in our weakness, so that when we are weak, then we are still strong in God's grace. Let's not be lost in this attitude of I'm human, I'm a work in progress, this flesh, and I'm not perfect. Oh my! Oh, we sit in this thing, we sit in this pity party of unperfection. Or we already knew we weren't perfect. We were met by God's perfect grace, and that's what strengthens us. That's where we receive our power. That's where God gets all the glory, because His grace meets you right where you are. This grace of God was a gift. And He said that wherever you are in your life, my grace is going to meet you. So you add on to your life, and you add on to your strength. God's grace is just adding, because even though you got stronger in God, God's grace is even more and more and more and more. Let's stop sitting in these pity parties and realize that God's grace is more than enough. Let's change our mind of what this thing called sufficiency is. But we find that it's more than enough. It's enough to meet. It's enough to meet any situation, any quantity or quality. And He says, my grace is sufficient. No matter what the situation, His grace is sufficient for that situation. My grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. You're looking for a way out, and God has already provided it. Let's push forward in this thing called grace. You're looking for a blessing, and God's grace is your blessing. We must stand on this thing called grace. We're not going to quit talking about this thing called grace, because when we are weak, then we find that God's grace makes us strong. God bless you. God love you. And remember, never let your independence rob you from your dependency on God. See you next week.
Like your life, no cross, no crown, can't give up now. Please heal tonight.
Tonight.
So we